Train Guy segment show. Also today in this segment, I'm at Greenfield Village and the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan.
The Henry Ford Museum and Greenfield Village is located on 20900 Oakwood Boulevard in Dearborn, Michigan, and also it is open if you check the web for more information about that. The Henry Ford Museum is a building that is part of the much larger Edison Institute, which also includes Greenfield Village. Also, the Henry Ford Museum opened in 1929, and also he dedicated the institution to his friend Thomas Edison, and celebrated with a grand opening known as Light's Golden Jubilee in honor of the 50th anniversary of his invention of the electric light. Also, it is the world's premier history destination that celebrates 300 years of American history and innovation. The museum has an eclectic collection of antique machinery, automobiles, trains, aircrafts, and famous homes, including John F. Kennedy's presidential limousine, Abraham Lincoln's chair from Ford's Theater, where he was assassinated in 1865, Thomas Edison's laboratory, and the Wright brothers' bicycle shop, which was moved there from Dayton, Ohio, and as well as that, it has the bus that Rosa Parks was on when she refused to give up her seat. And a lot of history you may have learned about that before in your life. The Wright brothers' home and cycle shop and Buckminster Fuller's Demaction House is also included. The village was founded in 1929 as an educational and historic landmark, maintaining the buildings and stories of America's past for future generations. Greenfield Village is where you journey into America's past to discover inspiration for bringing innovation and imagination into your life today. Also, it has 240 acres of land, of which only 90 acres are used for the attraction, the rest being forest, river, and extra pasture for the sheep and horses. It features some old buildings such as Thomas Edison's Menlo Park Laboratory and Complex, working farms, a carriage barn, cider mill, Liberty Craftworks, Armington and Sims Machine Shop, Davidson Gerson Gallery of Glass, Henry Ford's Model T, Bagley Avenue Workshop, Wright Cycle Shop, Edison at Work, and a lot you'll find there. And also, it has railroad-related structures like a roundhouse from the Detroit, Toledo, and Milwaukee Railroad, and the Smiths Creek Depot from the Grand Trunk Western Railroad, and etc. Also, as well as that, there are rides and other attractions there like pole glass with world-class artisans, 1867 baseball, and as well as that, the village has an operating railroad called the Weiser Railroad with old-time steam trains. Also, the railroad in Greenfield Village is known as the Weiser Railroad that goes around the village. The Weiser Railroad was started in 1970, and some staff members thought the village would look great with a railroad going around. And the first train ride was given on the 22nd of August in 1972. The first train ride was given at the village. And also, it features 3 station stops, which is the Smiths Creek Station, which the loading platform is just east of the structure, Firestone and Susquehanna, and the train takes you around the village. The village even inspired Walt Disney with the idea of building an amusement park in Southern California known as Disneyland, and he even had a love of trains too.
What you see right behind me is the Detroit, Toledo, and Milwaukee Roundhouse.
The Detroit, Toledo, and Milwaukee Marshall Roundhouse was built in 1884 in Marshall, Michigan, and is a former Detroit, Toledo, and Milwaukee Roundhouse. This roundhouse was originally in Marshall, Michigan, and used for the steam engines and where that work took place, and would service steam engines inside. Then later on, it got relocated to this spot in Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, and it is used for servicing the locomotives and equipment of Greenfield Village's railroad. And also you can even walk inside, and there is a balcony where you can view the shop from, and also you'll find a lot of interesting stuff inside as well. And also the steam engines are even in here whenever they're not running, as it's where they rest for the night or just sit whenever they're not being used, like when they're going under some work while not running or just sitting cold as well.
What you see right behind me is the turntable.
This turntable was built by Detroit Bridge and Iron Works in Detroit, Michigan in 1901, and also it is an Armstrong turntable. It was originally used for the Pierre Marquette Railroad in Petoskey, Michigan. Also, this turntable is pushed around by human beings like myself, and people turn a rail car and locomotive on it as well. Then later, it was moved to Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, and the well for it was built in front of the Detroit, Toledo, and Milwaukee Roundhouse as well. It is also used to rotate the train cars and locomotives from one track to another as well.
Right behind me is Detroit and Lima Northern 7.
Detroit and Lima Northern 7 was built by Baldwin in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1897, and is the 153 17th steam locomotive built by that factory, and is a 440 American type steam locomotive. This locomotive was originally used for the Detroit and Lima Northern Railroad, and this is its original number. Later, then in 1901, it was consolidated for the Detroit Southern Railroad and kept the number. Then a corp sale in 1905 to the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railway and still kept the number. Then in 1914, a corp sale to the same railroad, which changed to Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railroad and still numbered 7. Also, this locomotive was then transferred to Henry Ford in 1921 and was his personal locomotive, which was his favorite locomotive. Henry Ford was also the owner of the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railroad as well. In 1930, it was donated to the Edison Institute, and also came to be part of Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan. Then in 2012, it was restored to operation and once again operated under its own power, and also it can often be seen hauling the train around Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan these days as well. Also, Detroit and Lima Northern 7 is one of 2 440s that once served the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton, and 16 is at the Illinois Railway Museum in Union, Illinois, and Detroit and Lima Northern 7 can be found here at Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, and sometimes seen hauling the train around the village tracks as well.
What you see right behind me is the Grand Trunk Western Smiths Creek Depot.
The Grand Trunk Western Smiths Creek Station was built in 1859 and was originally located in Smiths Creek, Michigan, and was used for the Grand Trunk Western Railway. Thomas Edison would walk on board a Grand Trunk train and walk around the train selling newspapers and candy to the passengers. While riding one such train in 1863, Thomas Edison accidentally set the baggage car on fire while he was conducting a chemical experiment using phosphorus. When the fire was put out, an angry conductor of the Grand Trunk train threw Thomas Edison off the train at the Smiths Creek station. As Thomas Edison told Henry Ford the story, Henry Ford decided to go find the Smiths Creek station. Then he found it and purchased it from the Grand Trunk Western Railway, and then he had the depot moved from Smiths Creek, Michigan to Dearborn, Michigan. And also, it is seen here at Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan. And also, the platform where train boarding is just east of the structure as well.
Alright, you can see right here two cars that run on the tracks here at the Greenfield Village, where passengers ride on them to take a trip around the village. There are 5 more cars here as well. So let's look at the others. Okay, and here are 2 more cars that are rideable, but looks like they are getting a little bit of work done on them at the moment. And these cars have been part of Greenfield Village for a number of years, and probably since the opening. And there are 3 more cars, and let's go look at the other 3, shall we? The rifle cars. They are Dearborn, Michigan. There's all 7 the cars video. What you see right behind me is Detroit and Mackinac W52.
Detroit and Mackinac W52 was built somewhere in the 1910s and is a wooden caboose. This caboose's original number is unknown, and was used for the Detroit and Mackinac Railroad for a number of years. It was even used as the train crew's office and was at the back of freight trains as well. Later, it was likely put into maintenance of way service and received this number. Then it was retired and was then acquired by Greenfield Village, and there are times it is often seen rolling on the tracks at the village as well.
What you see right behind me is Hunters Point and Erie Basin 1.
Hunters Point and Erie Basin 1 was built by the J.M. Jones and Company in West Troy, New York in 1875 and is a horse-drawn car. This car was operated by the Brooklyn City Railroad on the line between Hunters Point, Long Island City, and Erie Basin in South Brooklyn, and this car would also be pulled by one horse and used in the state of New York. Also, it would carry 16 passengers on board at a time. Then later on, this car was then retired and then came to be part of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and it was a gift from the Brooklyn City Railroad Company as well. And it can also be seen right in this spot, just in the automobile display area in the museum as well, for all to see and enjoy.
Right behind me is the New York Central DeWitt.
The New York Central DeWitt Clinton was built by the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad in New York City, New York in 1893, and the locomotive has an 040 wheel arrangement, and this is the replica of the DeWitt Clinton. The original locomotive was built in 1831 and was designed by John B. Jervis and built by David Matthew at the West Point Foundry for the Mohawk Hudson in 1831. and operated on the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad, a New York Central predecessor. It was the Mohawk and Hudson's first locomotive, the first to operate in the state of New York, and only the fourth steam locomotive built in the U.S., shipped to Albany by riverboat. It made its debut at a celebration to mark the opening of steam operations on the line. Until then, trains had been pulled on the 16-mile line from Albany to Schenectady, New York by horses. The replica DeWitt Clinton traveled to fairs, expositions, and promotional events across the New York Central system into the 1950s. This replica of the DeWitt Clinton was built for the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Illinois. Named after the U.S. Senator and the 6th Governor of New York, who was largely responsible for construction of the Erie Canal, the original locomotive apparently weighed some 6,750 pounds, had 54-inch drivers and 5.5-inch by 16-inch cylinders. It appeared at the 1927 Fair of the Iron Horse in Maryland and was used for promotional purposes by the New York Central Railroad until loaned to the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan in 1935. It appeared at the 1933 to 1934 Chicago World's Fair, 1939-1940 New York World's Fair, and the Chicago Railroad Fair in 1948-1949. Today, the DeWitt Clinton can be seen right here on display at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and seen here on display today. It is displayed much as it would have appeared at its inauguration in 1831, pulling a car carrying water barrels and 3 passenger carriages made of stagecoach bodies attached to the railroad trucks. These were standard passenger conveyances of the day, although soon superseded by purpose-built passenger carriages. Today, it is on display at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, in the train display section of the museum as well.
You see right behind me is Mohawk and Hudson 1.
Mohawk and Hudson 1 was built by the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad in New York City, New York in 1893 and is a stagecoach. It is a passenger car that is made of stagecoach bodies in which riders would sit either inside or on outdoor rumble seats. This car and the other 2 cars with it were used for the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad as part of the DeWitt Clinton passenger train, and is a replica of an 1831 coach. This car and the replica locomotive traveled to fairs, expositions, and promotional events across the New York Central system into the 1950s, and also it was displayed with it and the 2 other cars with it at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Illinois. Then later it was purchased by Henry Ford in the early 1930s. It appeared with the replica locomotive at the 1933-1934 Chicago World's Fair, 1939-1940 New York World's Fair, and the Chicago Railroad Fair in 1948-1949. Today, this car, along with the 2 other cars and the replica DeWitt Clinton locomotive, can be seen right here on display at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and seen here on display today in the train display area in the museum.
Right behind me is Mohawk and Hudson 2.
Mohawk and Hudson 2 was built by the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad in New York City, New York in 1893 and is a stagecoach. It is a passenger car that is made of stagecoach bodies in which riders would sit either inside or on outdoor rumble seats. This car and the other two cars with it were used for the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad as part of the DeWitt Clinton passenger train, and is a replica of an 1831 coach. This car and the replica locomotive traveled to fairs, expositions, and promotional events across the New York Central system into the 1950s, and also it was displayed with it and the two other cars with it at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Illinois. Then later it was purchased by Henry Ford in the early 1930s. It appeared with the replica locomotive at the 1933-1934 Chicago World's Fair, 1939-1940 New York World's Fair, and the Chicago Railroad Fair in 1948-1949. Today, this car, along with the two other cars and the replica DeWitt Clinton locomotive, can be seen right here on display at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and seen here on display in the train display area in the museum.
What you see right behind me is Mohawk and Hudson 3.
Mohawk and Hudson 3 was built by the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad in New York City, New York in 1893 and is a stagecoach. It is a passenger car that is made of stagecoach bodies in which riders would sit either inside or on outdoor rumble seats. This car and the other two cars with it were used for the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad as part of the DeWitt Clinton passenger train, and is a replica of an 1831 coach. This car and the replica locomotive traveled to fairs, expositions, and promotional events across the New York Central system into the 1950s, and also it was displayed with it and the two cars with it at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Illinois. Then later it was purchased by Henry Ford in the early 1930s. It appeared with the replica locomotive at the 1933-1934 Chicago World's Fair, 1939-1940 New York World's Fair, and the Chicago Railroad Fair in 1948-1949. Today, this car, along with the two other cars and the replica DeWitt Clinton, can be seen right here on display at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and seen here on display today in the train display area in the museum.
What you see right behind me is the Stephenson Rocket.
This is a replica of the Stephenson Rocket that was built by Robert Stephenson and Company in Darlington, England in 1931. The original was built by the company in 1829. Also, the Stephenson Rocket is an 022 type steam locomotive and is the 4072nd steam locomotive built in the factory. Also, the locomotive is named Rocket as well. The original Rocket won Stephenson 500 pounds at the Rainhill Trials, a competition set up by the Liverpool and Manchester Railway to determine the best motive power to employ on the railroad. 10 locomotives were entered, but only 5 competed. The Rocket was the only one to compete the 3-day trials starting on the 6th of October 1829, over which it averaged 12 miles per hour and achieved a top speed of 30 miles per hour. Stephenson was consequently awarded the contract to build locomotives for the Liverpool and Manchester. Also, there are basically 3 replica rockets that are still around today, and there are 2 that can be found in the United States, including the one here at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and there is also one at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, Illinois. Also, there are 2 more over in England, and there is also only one that operates for all to enjoy and see. Also, this replica of the rocket came to be part of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and seen here in the train exhibit area in the building, and seen here on display as well.
Right behind me is Atlantic and Gulf
3. Atlantic and Gulf 3 was built by Rogers Locomotive Works in Paterson, New Jersey in 1858 and is the 812th steam locomotive built by that factory, and is a 440 American type steam locomotive. Also, the locomotive is named Sam Hill. It was originally used for the Atlantic and Gulf to work at one of its logging plants, and this is the original number. This locomotive was one of the first locomotives bought by the railroad and was named Satilla, after the river of that name. Chartered in 1856, the Atlantic and Gulf crossed southern Georgia from Thomasville to Screven, where it connected with the Savannah, Albany, and Gulf Railroad onto Savannah. The two railroads that were consolidated in 1863. The locomotive was sold to the Savannah, Florida and Western Railway in 1879 and kept the number. Then, in 1889, was sold to the J.J. McDonough Lumber Company and was renumbered 110. This locomotive worked at McDonough's for 35 years until it was purchased by Henry Ford in 1924. Henry Ford then renamed the locomotive Sam Hill in honor of an engineer who had worked on a Michigan Central Express that passed through Dearborn, Michigan, when he was a boy. Henry Ford loaned the locomotive to appear at the 1927 Fair of the Iron Horse in Maryland. Then he donated it to the Edison Institute in 1928, where it was renamed the President in honors of President Herbert Hoover when it was chosen to haul a set of specially built cars to the opening of the Institute. Also, the locomotive was put in the museum hall with the train display at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and seen on display where it can be seen today.
right behind me is Bangor and Aroostook 6.
Bangor and Aroostook 6 was built sometime between 1925 and 1928 and is a passenger coach, but it was built to replicate a Bangor and Aroostook coach from the 1855 to 1865 era. This car is a replica of an old-style passenger coach from the Bangor and Aroostook Railroad when passengers would ride aboard it as well, and was used in the state of Maine. As well as that, it is a recreation of a Civil War-era Bangor and Aroostook day car. Then later on, this car was added to the collection of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and can be seen on display in the train display area in the museum where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Chesapeake and Ohio 1601.
Chesapeake and Ohio 1601 was built by Lima Locomotive Works in Lima, Ohio in 1941 and is the 7821st steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 2666 Allegheny type steam locomotive and is an H8 class steam locomotive. This locomotive worked its life on the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, and also it was one of the first 10 Alleghenies built and numbered from 1600 to 1609, and it is one of the first 60-built Allegheny locomotives. The locomotive was designed to work over the Allegheny Mountains on Chesapeake and Ohio's Clifton Forge Division, and that's how these locomotives got the name Allegheny. These locomotives usually doubled on the most challenging part of the grade, on one at the front and one at the back, typically pulling 100-car coal trains eastbound from Hinton, West Virginia to the top of the grade at Allegheny. Then it was retired like in 1956 and was donated to the Edison Institution, and also it was brought to the museum on the rear of a Chesapeake and Ohio freight train, and it took 3 attempts to get the locomotive into the museum since it's the largest piece in the collection. First attempt, it derailed on the railroad tracks behind the museum. After removing its main and side rods, it was time for a second attempt. The locomotive made it as far as the museum's railroad doors, but was unable to pass through, even though the door had been widened to accommodate it. The problem was the switch inside the building. As the locomotive started to pass over the switch, its articulation caused the cab to swing over much further than anticipated. On the third attempt, following temporary modifications and component removals, the locomotive finally passed through the door, and it took its place in the museum and sat in its final resting spot. Today, it is part of the collection of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and also it can be seen on display in the train display hall as well. Also, Chesapeake and Ohio 1601 is one of 2 surviving 2666 Allegheny-type steam locomotives left in the world today, and 1604 is the other one, and is on display at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum in Baltimore, Maryland, and 1601 can be found here at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and also you can even visit the locomotive's cab and even sit where the engineer and fireman used to sit as well.
What you see right behind us, Fruit Growers Express 55667.
Fruit Growers Express 55667 was built by Fruit Growers Express Company in Alexandria, Virginia in 1924 and is a wooden refrigerator car. This car was once used on the Fruit Growers Express train many years ago, and it appears it was used on a line of refrigerator cars like it, and it would also carry what refrigerator cars would carry, like fruit on board and whatever else it might have hauled in the past as well. Then later on, this car was retired and came to be part of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and also it can be seen on display in the train display hall as well. Cleveland Railway Company 0140 was built by the Brill Car Company in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1892 and is a Brill streetcar. This streetcar was originally used for the Cleveland Electric Railway and originally numbered 165, and it was used for like hauling people on board when being used for the Cleveland Electric Railway Company. Then in 1910, it was then used for the Cleveland Railway Company and kept the number. Then in 1916, the number was changed to 0140. Then in 1942, it was then used on the Cleveland Transit System and kept the number, and this car was used most of its life in Cleveland, Ohio. Then later on it was retired, and in 1954 came to be part of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and seen on display in the train exhibit area in the building as well.
You see right behind these Fort Collins Municipal Railway 26.
Fort Collins Municipal Railway 26 was built by American Car Company in St. Louis, Missouri in 1922 and is a Birney trolley car. This car was originally used for the Cheyenne Electric Railway and was originally numbered 7. This car was originally used for Cheyenne, Wyoming, then in 1924 was purchased by the Fort Collins Municipal Railway. It was also used for the Fort Collins Municipal Railway with sister trolleys on that trolley line in Fort Collins, Colorado, and would also carry people on board in the neighborhood of Fort Collins. Then in 1951 it was then retired from service, and then later it was donated to the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and also it sits right in this spot in the train display area in the museum as well for all to see and enjoy.
What you see right behind these Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton 77.
Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton 77 was built by the Standard Steel Car Company in Butler, Pennsylvania in 1925 and is a wooden caboose. This caboose was once used for the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railroad many years ago as the train crew's office and would be used behind freight trains for the railroad as well. Then later on, the car was retired and came to be part of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and also it can be seen on display in the train display hall as well.
What you see right behind these Detroit and Mackinac 100.
Detroit and Mackinac 100 was built by the Barney and Smith Car Company in Dayton, Ohio sometime between 1901 and 1905 and is a combination car of a baggage car and a passenger car. This car was used on passenger trains in the state of Michigan on the Detroit and Mackinac Railroad, and also it has 3 compartments, one for passengers riding on board with 7 seats, and the other is where baggage would be put inside, and also another is a smoking compartment. Then later on the car was retired and then came to be part of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and seen on display in the train exhibit area in the building as well.
What you see right behind me is Canadian Pacific 400,850.
Canadian Pacific 400,850 was built by the Canadian Pacific's Angus shops in Montreal, Canada in the 1920s and is a wedge snowplow. This snowplow was used for the Canadian Pacific's maintenance of way, and also whenever it was used to clear snow off the tracks, it would take 2 locomotives to push it and to have it push snow off the tracks of the Canadian Pacific Railroad as well. Then later on, This snowplow was retired and then came to be part of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, where it is on display today in the train exhibit area in the museum as well.
What you see right behind me is Bessemer and Lake Erie 154.
Bessemer and Lake Erie 154 was built by Baldwin in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1909 and is the 333/70th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 280 consolidation type steam locomotive and is a C3B class steam locomotive. This locomotive was used for being a freight locomotive when being used on the Bessemer and Lake Erie Railroad, as it would be used for hauling heavy loads of iron ore on the railroad. Then, in 1953, it was retired and in October 1983 was sold to the Illinois Railway Museum in Union, Illinois. Then, later that same month, it was then transferred to the Edison Institution and then moved to the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and the Illinois Railway Museum traded it for Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton 16, which is a 440 American-type steam locomotive, and this locomotive can be seen right here in this spot in the train display where it can be seen today. Also, Bessemer and Lake Erie 154 is the only surviving Bessemer and Lake Erie 280 left in the world today and can be seen here at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Ingersoll-Rand 90.
Ingersoll-Rand 90 was built by Alco, General Electric, and Ingersoll-Rand in Phillipsburg, New Jersey in 1926, and the builder's number for Alco is 66752, and General Electric is 10132, and is a 60-ton box cab type diesel locomotive and is a GE Class BB120-120-0 4HM 840-840G. This locomotive was one of the first successful diesel-powered locomotives ever built. It was used as a promotional demonstrator switching in Ingersoll-Rand's Phillipsburg works in Phillipsburg, New Jersey, and moving freight cars around as well. Then later on, it was retired in the late 1960s, and in 1970, it was donated to the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. Then it went on display in 1984 and is seen here on display in the building with the train display as well.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed learning about trains with me today in Matthew Lapp Train Guy segment show. Also, I hope to see you all again in the next segment. And if you didn't subscribe to my channel yet, the subscribe button is just below the video screen. And if you didn't give my Facebook page a like yet, here's where you can find it. And if you didn't follow my Instagram page yet either, here's where you can find it as well. And also, be sure to get your merch at teesprings.com. Link is in the description box below, along with the Facebook and Instagram pages. And remember to subscribe to the Train Guy. So this is Matthew Lapp, host of Matthew Lapp Train Guy segment show. Sign out until next time. All aboard!